Hello and welcome. My name is Habib Heydarian, and I'm a program manager on the .NET team. I'd like to welcome everyone in the room, on channel line, and wherever you may be in the world to today's presentation. It is a super exciting time to be a .NET developer. There are so many changes that's happening right now, whether if it's open source, cross-platform development, or the new innovations that we're making in .NET to make developers more productive and also allow you to reach more customers. In yesterday's presentation, Satya briefly demoed the set of investments that we're making in .NET to take it to additional operating systems, including Linux as well as OSX. Today, I'd like to spend some more time on exactly what that means and also really start the conversation about where we're going with .NET on both Linux and OSX. Let's start with some caveats. The bits that I'm going to show you today are extremely fresh. In fact, if this was the Microsoft of 10 years ago, I'm pretty sure we wouldn't be sharing with you this news today. And we'll be having secret meetings for the next 3 years about what to call the thing and also when to share it. But times have changed. In fact, what's happening is that all the work that I'm going to show you today is happening in the open as part of the open source work that we're doing on GitHub. So the content of this presentation is subject to change. The bits that you'll see today are raw, and they're crunchy, but they're tasty. And that really depends on your definition of what tasty means. So, but what I really would love to do is, at the end of this presentation, point you to some URLs where you can actually get the bits today and start playing with them. And last but not least, this is just the beginning of the journey. The bits today are not production ready, and they won't be ready for a while yet, but would love to engage everyone on this journey and understand what developers want from this new stack that we're building on both OS X as well as Linux. So here's what today's journey looks like. I'm going to start off with a very brief demo to show you what the experience looks like on Linux. And then I'd like to go through essentially 6 chapters that walk you from everything from acquisition to once you've got the bits, how do you actually create an application and deploy it? And then once you've deployed it, how do you then focus on a couple of advanced topics, including how you actually can build the source yourself and access native APIs. And then we're going to spend a little bit of time wrapping up. With that, let's actually dive in, and I'm going to do a very short demo to highlight some of the core capabilities that we are enabling with .NET on Linux and OS X. Some of you might have already seen this demo, but I'd like to showcase a couple of really, really important topics. So first of all, I'm using Ubuntu 14.04, and this is the shell that I've basically set up. Let me just quickly look at the current directories that I have available to me. And I'm going to cd into .NET, go to the Linux directory, and then in here, basically run my application. Now, while this is not an earth-shattering demo, there are a set of very, very important things to realize here. First one is this. There is no machine-wide installation. All the .NET bits are in a single directory. In fact, these are all the files that make up .NET on Linux right now. The other really important thing that you'll notice in a second is I can use whatever is my favorite editor. In this case, let's actually look at VI, for those of you who are fans of VI. And the most remarkable thing about the source file right here is, in fact, how unremarkable it is. What I mean by that is you do not see any if-defs. You don't see any Linux-specific APIs being called. You don't see any p-invokes. It's just plain old C# code. One of the promises that we are making with .NET on both Linux as well as Mac OS X is the fact that the same code that you compile on Windows can actually run exactly on OS X and Linux as well. So with that, you'll have true portability. And we will take care of all the work when it comes to making sure that your code runs on each of the individual platforms. So what we just saw were a couple of really important things. First of all, you'll see this command core run. That's essentially our, you can think of bootstrapper or harness that loads up the .NET exe and runs it. The key difference here is that on Windows, something like core run is actually baked into the operating system. So you can just run your exe from the command line without having to worry about bootstrapping it. With both Linux as well as OS X right now, you'll actually have to basically run the harness yourself to be able to run the application. Let's start with the first chapter, which is the why and the what. The first question that I get is, why do I care about .NET on Linux or OS X, and then what is it? Let's start with the latter question. I'm sure some of you have seen this slide before. This is basically the universe of .NET 2015 that we're releasing at both build as well as when we release .NET RTM. What you can see is we have .NET Framework 4.6, which is our next version of .NET on Windows. And then we have essentially a core .NET, which we're calling .NET Core, that runs not only on Windows, but also Linux and OS X. And specifically, the part that I'm going to be focusing on today is the part that I've highlighted. With the stack that we're going to enable on both Linux and OS X, what you have is a set of shared capabilities. This includes the JIT, the GC, compilers, the libraries, as well as various other capabilities. Then on top of that, you have core CLR that's been now extended to both Linux and OS X. And then on top of that, you have the ASP.NET 5 app model. And that's the thing that I really want to highlight is the fact, again, that if you were to write an ASP.NET 5 application in the future, you can actually take the exact same application and then run it on Windows, OS X, as well as Linux. Now we've talked about the what. Let's focus a little bit on the why. The question of why do I care about .NET on Linux and OS X? Specifically on Linux, what we've seen is a plethora of new workloads that are really thriving out there. These examples are things like Elasticsearch, Hadoop, and so forth that kind of grew up on Linux. And what we're finding is a lot of enterprises are asking, how do I interoperate my existing .NET code with those workloads? And so developers are asking, well, if I've got a .NET app that I want to also run on Linux, how do I go about doing that? The next one is, for companies and organizations, it represents brand new opportunities. We've talked to a lot of customers whose customers have requirements of being able to run their applications in non-Windows environments. For them, it makes a ton of sense that they're able to offer a new product to new customers that they could not reach before. Third, it's about diversification. So if you talk to CTOs, they often talk about it'd be nice, just like any portfolio, if I could diversify my platforms so that I can take advantage of any changes and also mitigate risks. And last but not least is around server consolidation in the cloud. What we're finding is, as customers are moving to the cloud, if they decide to consolidate on a single operating system, and that operating system happens to be a non-Windows operating system, then what they really want to do is be able to leverage the existing .NET apps and run them in the cloud and on Linux. So these are the 4 core reasons why we are making a big, bold bet on .NET on Linux. And this is one of the also reasons why I'd love to start this conversation with everyone in this room and online and really understand what are the core set of scenarios that we can help with .NET on Linux. So what's the benefit to developers? So if you have an existing .NET application, and granted that the application uses things like, for example, MVC and Web API, you can pretty much seamlessly move that to ASP.NET 5, in which case that'll also run on .NET on Linux. The other thing is we are going to have first-class support in Visual Studio to allow you to edit, deploy, and debug your application remotely to a Linux machine. And also, if you happen to use OSX through new offerings such as Visual Studio Code, and also your favorite editor, such as Sublime Text, you'll be able to write code on a Mac OS X and be able to deploy it to Linux. And last but not least, and this is a really important point, .NET Core is open source from the ground up. That means if you or anyone online wants to add a feature, fix bugs, you can actually now contribute your code to .NET Core, and that code would run on Windows, OS X, as well as Linux. OK, let me talk a little bit about the acquisition experience now. The acquisition experience is extremely flexible when it comes to both .NET on Linux and OS X. Let's briefly focus on the development experience. So if you were to download Visual Studio 2015 RC today, .NET Core is already installed as part of Visual Studio, so you don't need to install it separately. Also, if you're so inclined for more advanced developers, you can actually clone the entire source code, both the framework and the runtime on Windows, and actually build it yourself. And we've seen some developers already do that because two things. They want to get familiar with the actual source code itself, and also it allows them to actually understand what are the core capabilities that they can take advantage of, both currently and also as the code develops in the future. If you are developing on OS X, you can actually, and I have a link at the end of the slides, you can go and download a tar file. And for those of you who are not familiar, a tar file is basically a packaging mechanism that's very popular on both Linux and Unix environments. And so that tarball, you can easily untar that the tar file onto your OS X environment and be able to run the app right then and there. Or you can use one of the most popular packaging technologies on OS X, which is Homebrew. And there is already a Homebrew formula on GitHub that you can go and actually use to be able to download the entire set of bits on your OS X machine. Now, that's your options for development. What about deployment? What can you actually do on Linux? Well, two things. You can actually use your Linux box as a development environment as well as a deployment environment. If you want to use it as a development environment and also a deployment environment, very similar to Mac, you can download a tar file and untar it and get going very, very quickly. What we've also done is we've actually created a VM that's hosted in the Azure VM gallery today. And you can go and fire that up and then get going within a couple of minutes, so you can start experimenting with the bits after this meeting, in fact. The one thing that we're working on right now, and this is one of the key investments that we're making, not just in .NET, but also in Visual Studio as a whole, is support for Docker. What we're working on right now, and we hope to release it very shortly after build, is to actually create a Docker file that'll have the entire .NET stack on it, and you'll be able to basically get that Docker file from Docker Hub and be able to get going very, very quickly as well. So what you see right here is a plethora of offerings, and it really depends what your development environment is and also what you plan to do with .NET on both OS X as well as Linux going forward. Now, what does it actually look like once you've got going? Well, if you're using an OS X today, using Homebrew is extremely easy. What you basically do is you tap the ASP.NET DNX source, and then once you've done that, you can simply go and update it. And then after updating it, you install essentially the .NET version manager, that's the DNVM, and then I'll go into more detail about running the essentially the bootstrapper DNX with the cross-platform web server that's called Kestrel. What we've done is we've actually documented all this on our GitHub repository, so you can go ahead and look at the instructions in much more detail there. One thing I did forget to mention is before you can actually use Homebrew, you have to download it from brew.sh, and then once you've done that, you can get going within a couple of minutes literally. And you don't have to take all these notes down since these slides will be shared afterwards, but if you were to download the tar file on Linux, then you can basically untar the tar file and then also specify to the .NET version manager exactly which version of the runtime to use and install. And then once you've done that, very similarly, you basically bootstrap the app and the environment using Kestrel and get going from there. So if you've been using either OSX or Linux, these things should be very familiar to you. However, what I've found is if you're primarily coming from the Windows background, a lot of these concepts and notions will be brand new to you. So what we found is there's a bit of a learning curve for developers as they start to ramp up on essentially building their apps on either OSX or Linux. But as I said, I think we've done a pretty good job of providing a lot of documentation, which I'll point you to towards the end of the presentation. OK, so now that you've gone ahead and actually downloaded the bits, how do you go about creating and building an app? Again, you have several development environment options, depending on whether you're doing a development on Windows, on OSX, or on Linux. On Windows, you can use Visual Studio 2015 RC as is. The only thing is if you wanted to basically also use it with Docker, you have to download the Docker extensions, which I'll have a link to towards the end of this presentation. Or the other option is the new offering, which is Visual Studio Code, which is a cross-platform IDE that runs on all three environments. On OSX, not only can you use Visual Studio Code, but you can use what I'd consider to be the most popular development environment / editor on OSX, which is Sublime Text. Or if you're so inclined, there's other offerings such as Atom and so on and so forth. Similarly, on Linux, you can use Visual Studio Code, and I'll show you a brief demo of that as well. And also, if you come from a Unix / Unix background, you can use VI, Emacs, or any of the other editors that are available to you. In fact, I'd say Linux has an extremely rich ecosystem when it comes to editors and IDEs, and there are many different options to explore. I've just listed a few of those. So again, one of the things I want to highlight is the fact that if you are from a Unix background, some of this should be no surprise at all. However, if you're from the Windows background, some of this will be brand new to you. OK. Let me briefly switch over to a demo that shows our integration with Docker. This is a similar demo that Satya showed in the keynote yesterday. But the goal of this demo is just to highlight exactly what the workflow looks like. So what I've got here is a vanilla ASP.NET 5 application. And the way I created the application is by simply going to Web, ASP.NET 5, ASP.NET application. And then what I did within that is I basically chose the ASP.NET 5 preview template. I didn't make any change to the code, and it's just a vanilla app. What I want to do at this point, then, I want to deploy this application to Docker. And the Docker is going to exist on a VM on my Azure account. And then I want to be able to run the application from there. So the first step that I'll do is I need to go ahead and download the Visual Studio extensions for Docker. And once I've done that, you basically go ahead and select the Publish button. And then here, I've already created a Docker container previously, but I can certainly go ahead and validate that I have a correct connection to my Docker container. And so this will take a little while, and there should be a single container that I've established previously. I'm going to select that, validate the connection to make sure that it works, and it does work, and I'm going to publish it. Now, what this will do is it'll basically take the application, it will Dockerize the application, and it'll start to upload the bits. And on the actual Web Publish Activity tab, you can see exactly the set of things that the application, that the Visual Studio integration is doing. Depending on your mileage, this may take a little bit of time, but ultimately at the end of this, what you will see is it'll open up your browser and it'll basically navigate to the home page of the application. While this is cooking, so to speak, what you'll see is the integration of Docker within Visual Studio does nothing but just automate the Docker commands. In fact, you can see this is the application itself, and now it's hosted in the cloud without me doing anything. This application, ladies and gentlemen, is running on Linux as we speak. So it's the exact same application that I ran previously before coming here on Windows, and it's the exact same application that I had run on OSX. And so the integration experience is absolutely seamless. One of the things is if you are brand new to the Docker world, it can be quite daunting to learn the various Docker commands and also understand exactly how to Dockerize your application and how to upload your file. With the Visual Studio integration, the experience is absolutely seamless, and it literally takes a couple of button clicks to get there. OK. Previously, I briefly just touched base on this couple of new things around DNX. DNX stands for .NET Execution Environment. Think of it as basically a bootstrapper that runs your application. And also, if you're in today's world on Windows, you're familiar with IIS as your web server. We have now created a brand new cross-platform server, which is called Kestrel. Kestrel is you can think of it as essentially can coexist with IIS. But if you want to host your ASP.NET 5 website on Linux, Kestrel is the web server that you use to host your applications going forward. And the one thing that I want to highlight, and I'm going to briefly show you a demo, and is I'm going to change to a different Linux environment. And with this environment, I'm going to actually show you the sample application that we're shipping with .NET on Linux at build. It's called Parts Unlimited. And what I've done is I've created a shell command already that basically allows me to execute the web server command. Once I've done that, I'm going to fire up Firefox and simply navigate to where the URL is for my web app, and then I'll show you the Parts Unlimited application. So I'm hosting on localhost, port 5004. And the thing that I really want to highlight with this app is this is a full-blown E2E commerce application. And it's running ASP.NET 5 on Linux. And I can basically order parts. I can also do things like credit card transactions and so forth. And this is all running on .NET on Linux. And I can take the exact same application right now and deploy it to Windows or Mac OS X, and I don't have to make a single change. As I mentioned, today we are shipping this application as a sample, and so I would highly encourage you to go and play around with it to actually see how the inner workings of .NET on Linux work. I wasn't half kidding when I said the bits are very, very fresh. So in fact, as I just ran the application, you can see that there were a few exceptions that were thrown, and that's exactly what we're working on right now. We're bringing up the platform as we speak. OK. One of the other very common questions that I get is, what about my data? I have all my data in, let's say, SQL Server on-prem, or some folks have it on Azure SQL database. And do I have to rewrite all my code to access my SQL Server on-prem or SQL Azure DB? And the answer is absolutely no. What we've done is we've actually enabled the ADO.NET providers on Linux so that once you've moved your application over to .NET on Linux, your data access APIs will just work as is. And the aim here is that you don't have to make any changes to your code. You don't have to migrate any of your data. Your data can exist in the SQL Server or Azure SQL DB. And also, the other thing that I want to mention is, while we're not there yet, we are considering other data providers so that not only can you remotely access SQL Server or Azure SQL DB, but in the future, if there are, since there are native database providers on Linux, you'll be able to access those as well going forward. But at this point, we're still working through a number of opportunities there. OK. I'm going to skip this demo, and the reason being that we basically could not pull this demo off. But basically, the idea here was that your application would be accessing the Northwind database and pulling data back on Linux. OK. The next topic that I wanted to mention is the Visual Studio Code. For those of you who had the opportunity to see the keynote yesterday, it's a lightweight editor that runs on OS X, Windows, as well as Linux. And it provides pretty much every capability that you expect from a full-blown editor: IntelliSense, refactoring, colorization, and so forth. And you can edit and compile the application locally today. What we're working on right now is, in fact, there's a session at 3:30 where Chris Dias and co are going to show you a lot more details on Visual Studio Code. But things like debugging are still work in progress. So you can't debug your application locally or remotely from Visual Studio Code yet. But it's something that we're working on as we speak. OK. So now you've got the bits, you've created the application, and what are your options for deploying an application to Linux? First and foremost, I'd say the most important thing that's a vast difference from Windows is the fact that deployment on Linux is Xcopy, meaning you simply can copy a directory to wherever you like, and then you run your application there. Having said that, we are working through essentially providing packages. So if you've used, let's say, apt-get on Linux, you know that you can basically download packages from a central server. And in the future, we want to make the deployment very seamless and have full integration with package managers such as apt-get. You can deploy your application on-premise. You can deploy it to Azure IaaS. So as I mentioned, we are providing an out-of-the-box Azure VM that you can go to the gallery and download, as well as actually instantiate. We will be providing a Docker container, and also you can go ahead and Dockerize your own application. And also, as Satya announced yesterday, we'll also have support for Windows containers in the future. The other thing that I really want to highlight is you can basically use the native deployment technology that is available on your operating system to deploy your application. So today, a lot of people are used to things like MSIs on Windows, for example. However, if you're developing on OSX, you might have a completely different mechanism than you might have on Linux or Windows. Again, we are working through providing a set of best practices on how you deploy your application. But fundamentally, the biggest shift here is the fact that there is no central .NET, so to speak, installed on your machine. We're not making any change to your registry and so forth. Removing .NET is, if you're familiar in the Linux world, is simply a matter of removing a directory, and that's how you uninstall your application, for example. As I said, we'll also provide options in several package managers, but inherently, you have an infinite amount of choice when it comes to deploying your application from any of the operating systems. OK, I highlighted the fact that as of yesterday evening, we now have a Linux VM on Azure Marketplace. In fact, if you were to go there now, you'd actually find the fact that the Core CLR Beta 5 VM on the marketplace right now. I do want to highlight the fact that the current version of .NET on Linux and OSX is 64-bit only. We are working on plans to figure out how we also make it available for 32-bit operating systems. But for now, it's 64-bit only. The other thing that I really want to highlight is that we've worked hard for Build to provide a turnkey solution so that you don't have to get the framework, the runtime, ASP.NET 5, the sample application, and then put it all together yourself. If you were to basically instantiate this VM, everything is available on the VM. So you can get going with several tutorials that we are providing as part of the Visual Studio 2015 RC at Build. And you will hear more news about that very shortly on our blog, hopefully. OK, I know you probably have heard a lot of hype around containers, and some of you have probably are experts or are using containers heavily. For those of you who haven't, this is somewhat of a new world to Windows developers. The idea behind containers is quite simple. It's basically meant to be as an isolation unit and also a shipping unit. So if you were to kind of visualize literally a container on a ship where it essentially isolates the contents from all the other containers, and it also keeps it safe. So it doesn't matter if you're shipping, let's say, a car, or shipping a bunch of chairs, or you're shipping a bunch of toys. What you're making sure is that the content is isolated and safe from all the other content that might be aboard that ship. And that's kind of the very, very simplified view of what a container is. Now, Docker is by far the most popular container technology out there. In fact, if you look at it, most of the major vendors now have some kind of support for Docker. And that's, in fact, exactly what we're also doing as of Visual 2015, where you can Dockerize your application right within Visual Studio, as I showed you as well. The other thing that I want to mention is this does not preclude you from also running Docker from the command line inside Windows. So you can, if you want to kind of dig deep and do more of advanced scenarios, you can use Docker from the command line inside Windows. But by default, we want to make the experience absolutely seamless. There are a couple of sessions at Build that really dig deep into containers and also Docker in more detail. So I'm not going to cover it too much, but the thing I do want to mention is you're going to hear us talk a lot more about Dockerizing .NET or providing a Docker container for X, Y, and Z, and it's just become a de facto part of our lingo going forward because that's how we expect a lot of customers to ship their software via both Docker as well as Windows containers going forward. The Docker tools are available, which I'll have even more information towards the end of the presentation. OK. I want to double-click a little bit right now and spend a little bit of time on more advanced topics. The first thing that I want to cover is this. For those of you who are interested in actually really getting to the details of .NET, we now allow you to basically build both the framework and the CLR yourself. Unfortunately, currently, we don't have the capability to allow you to build on Linux or OSX, but I can tell you that's coming. As of today, you can get essentially the source code for both Core CLR and Core FX and compile it on Windows yourself. Because by far the majority of Core CLR is all native code, you basically have to download CMake, which allows you to run the C++ compiler. And also, once you've done that, you can also separately compile the Core FX source code by running the build command. In fact, you run the build command for both of these. One of the other things that you're going to hear us talk a lot more about is, git clone this and git clone that, git fork this and git fork that. And that's also another thing that's going to become part of our nomenclature forward because pretty much all of the work that we do in the open is done on GitHub. What that means is, if you want to see how we're progressing on .NET on Linux and OSX, you only have to go to GitHub to see what the latest commits were and also what the latest proposals and issues are. And that's going to be the way that we worked, and that's in fact the way that we worked in the last 6 months. A number of customers, in fact, already know exactly what we're working on because everything that we've been doing up to this point is already on GitHub. If you're interested to see where are we as of today, we have the Core CLR running on OSX, as well as Linux and Windows. And just very recently, with the help of the community, we ported the bits over to FreeBSD. So if you or your organization has a requirement for FreeBSD, there will be an opportunity in the future to basically run your application on FreeBSD. But we have some more work to do going forward there. OK. Again, just a very brief introduction to GitHub because it's an area where we're going to talk to a lot. GitHub is the home of the Octocat. They have some amazingly beautiful renderings of Octocat. There's the default one. But most importantly, it's the home of all of our open source projects. So it doesn't matter if you're interested in the runtime, the libraries, ASP.NET, Entity Framework, anything that we do, it's all done in GitHub. The really nice thing is very similar to Docker, how we are basically abstracting away all the complexities of GitHub. Visual Studio 2015 RC now has support for GitHub. So in fact, if you were just to go to Team Explorer, one of the options that you'll see now is support for GitHub, where you can go and essentially clone a repo right from within Visual Studio, and you don't have to go to the command line to do that. And as I mentioned, that's going to become more and more important. To give you an example, the Parts Unlimited sample that I showed you, it's hosted on GitHub. So if you want to clone it, if you want to play around yourself, you can either do it from the command line, or you can go to the Visual Studio Team Explorer and clone it from there. You have both options. OK. The other advanced thing that I want to talk about is, and this is one of the things that I love about .NET. One of the questions that comes up often is, OK, so there's a native C, C++ library on Linux. Let's say it could be a SIMD library. It could be something to do with machine learning that I really want to use from my .NET application. How do I go about doing that? Unlike some of our competitors where you have to jump through a lot of hoops, the thing that I love about what we've done with .NET Analytics is the fact that we basically allow you to p-invoke the native APIs right from within your application. So here's the most simple way or example to think about it. So if you have, for example, printf, which is in libc, it's as simple as basically decorating it with DLL import, which is exactly how you would do it on Windows today. And then once you've done that, you can call printf. And the reason why this model is wonderful in my mind is the fact that now that because we're going over to Linux, it's not that you have to learn all these brand new sort of concepts and paradigms of how you actually interoperate with your capabilities on Linux. Another question that I get is, can I interoperate with Java code, for example? A lot of enterprises today not only run .NET, but they also run Java. And right now, we don't have a native/inherent way to interact with Java. But one of the things we'd love to hear more about is what are the exact scenarios where people want to interoperate with Java on .NET on Linux. The thing I really want to stress is that it's exactly the same as pinvoke on Windows. There is no secret sauce here. However, obviously, if you take a dependency on a native capability on the actual platform itself, then by default, that code isn't portable. So then you have to if-def things out to make sure that it runs equally well on, let's say, Windows as well as Linux. OK. I want to spend a few minutes to talk about our North Star. And this is really, really important. And the reason why it's important is we need pretty much all .NET developers to help us steer .NET on Linux and OSX. The reason why I say that is just like everyone in this room and online, we also are brand new to this world. .NET is going through a very, very important transition right now. And we want to make sure that not only are we bringing our .NET developers along, but also their existing investments. And that's super, super important for us. Where are we today? Where we are today is you can basically download the tar files for both Linux and OSX. You can evaluate the VM on the Azure Marketplace. And you can basically evaluate the bits using a Docker file, which we'll announce very, very shortly. You can create, edit, and publish ASP.NET 5 apps from within Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code. However, we have a long way to go yet. For example, let me share with you some of the most often questions that I get. What about remote debugging from Visual Studio? The demo that Satya showed yesterday was exactly that, was a demo at this point. Although we can make it work, it's still not robust. So we have some work to do to make remote debugging seamlessly work from Visual Studio to Linux. The other thing is local debugging. If you're using Visual Studio Code, for example, on OSX, which is quite a popular development platform, the first question that comes up is, great, I just built my .NET app on OSX. How do I go about debugging it? MS Build support is another very important topic that comes up. Right now, we are still working through enabling MS Build support on .NET, on Linux and OSX. And so one of the options today is to download Mono, and I'll go into a little more detail on that as well, which basically provides then support for MS Build. But in the future, one of our goals is to provide inherent support for MS Build on both OSX as well as Linux going forward. The last part is by far the most important thing, production readiness. Production readiness is something that takes both time and lots of effort. There's a key difference between running a stack let's say, on a device versus running a stack on a server. And what I mean by that is it takes an incredible amount of time and energy to harden the stack so that it can meet the server requirements and also cloud requirements. Having said that, that's where we are today. What's our promise when we actually RTM? Right now, we're very much work in progress. And as you saw through some of the demos, we're still not even kind of ready for demoing some of the bits. The promise that we're making is this. .NET apps will run in a production environment, including Docker and Windows containers. This is for both on-prem as well as cloud scenarios. So today, if you still want to continue running your app on-prem, you can absolutely use .NET on Linux in the future once we RTM. Developers will be able to edit, compile, and debug either remotely from Visual Studio or locally from Visual Studio Code. The third bullet is really, really important. This is a very big promise, meaning that if you were to only use platform-agnostic features within your application, our promise is that that application will run on Windows, OS X, as well as Linux. As I mentioned, if you were to take dependencies, such as platform pinvoke into native APIs, then you have to basically if-def things out to make sure that it runs correctly on the corresponding platform. The fourth bullet, also extremely important. A very common question that comes up is, well, there's this ecosystem of libraries. I want to be able to also not only use my own existing libraries, but also use third-party libraries that I've been using in my app. And one of the promises that we're aiming at is, granted that those libraries don't essentially take advantage of some of the features that are only available in .NET Framework 4.6, you'll be able to run those libraries on .NET Core. And this is a really important point. How do you know whether the library that you want to use will not only work on .NET Framework 4.6, but also work on .NET Core on Linux and OS X? Well, what we are doing is, and we're going to blog about it very shortly, we're making available to you a tool called, it's a web service called the API portability tool. What it does is you submit your assembly to this tool online, and it'll generate a report for you. The report will highlight where are the gaps between what your assembly requires and what the platform provides. And what we've seen working with some of our very early customers, it's a really good roadmap to see where the gaps are. I'll give you an example. This stack right here does not have a UI platform. There is no WinForms, there's no WPF, and so on and so forth. We had a customer that had taken a dependency on Windows Forms in their server scenarios. By using the API portability tool, they found out immediately that they have to change some of the code that took dependency on Windows Forms to be able to run on the .NET Core stack on Linux. And that's one example of the type of things that you'll be able to do using the .NET portability tool. The fifth point is by far the most important on this slide, I would say. I get this question all the time. So you guys are releasing a Microsoft stack on an OS that you do not produce. How does the support work? How does the servicing work? And the promise that we are making is that the stack that we release on Linux, we are going to support it, we are going to service it. So in the future, for example, if you run into a production environment that has something to do with the Microsoft code, exactly as you do on Windows, you can pick up the phone to a product support and ask for help. That's the promise that we are making. What it means is it's actually introducing some new challenges for us. We have, I'd say, world-class experts on how you diagnose .NET apps on Windows, but we are still building our muscles of what's the best way to diagnose production problems on Linux. So, but our promise is the fact that not only will we continue to support it, but we'll also service it as well. So I intentionally crossed out supported. The reason is, as I mentioned, the bits are extremely fresh. And so for build, the only distro that we've tested the bits on is Ubuntu 14.04 long-term support. And so if you are wanting to evaluate the bits, I'd highly encourage you to do it on Ubuntu as well. However, that does not preclude you from trying out the bits on any other distro, be it Red Hat, CentOS, Debian, whatever else it may be. But your mileage might vary. So if you really want to experiment, I'd encourage you to get Ubuntu. And then the other thing that I do want to mention is that's our starting point. We are considering what it would take to bring .NET to other distros. And so that's another thing that you can expect in the coming months for us to make additional announcements around. I'm sure some of you in the crowd are asking, what about Mono? Mono has been out since at least 2004. It's an open source stack, and it has a thriving community. And in fact, it's extremely popular for building .NET applications for iOS and Android. Why didn't you guys just use Mono to enable these scenarios? And so the thing that I want to highlight here is that Mono is fantastic for building device applications for iOS and Android. However, it is not production grade. What I mean by that is when you're running a server or cloud workload, you really have to think about throughput, scale up, also out. And also, what does the mean time to failure look like for a server/cloud workload? These are all the challenges that we are taking on in producing .NET on Linux, where Mono will continue to thrive on iOS as well as Android, and we continue to have a great relationship with our partners in Xamarin. In fact, we now have some of the Mono contributors contributing to .NET on Linux and OSX as well. So the community muscle that's been built up during the last few years, we are absolutely leveraging that as well. In fact, some of the things that's already happened is they're starting to leverage the exact same C# compiler that compiles your code on .NET Linux as they will do for Mono as well. So we're sharing investments and capabilities as we speak. You're probably sitting in your room and asking yourself, OK, this is all great, but how do I actually get started on this today? So here's typically what I always tell our customers. If you're creating a brand new applications for Linux, I would encourage folks to actually start with an ASP.NET 5 template. Because what that will do is it'll guide you. It'll make sure that the app that you're writing on Windows is the exact same app that you can basically deploy to Linux. And the other thing that I encourage folks to do is evaluate the Parts Unlimited sample application. It gives you a pretty good idea of what are the sort of capabilities that are available today, and also what are the types of apps that you can run on .NET on Linux. As I mentioned, Parts Unlimited is a sample that's on GitHub. So in order for you to get it, you'd have to basically clone the repo. And as you saw, you can do that from both Visual Studio as well as from the command line. If you are moving an existing application to Linux, I would say I would add one more thing to those two bullets. First of all, I would highly encourage you to actually start transitioning your application to ASP.NET 5 on Windows. Those bits are actually RC quality today. Unlike the bits on Linux and OSX that are pre-alpha, the bits on Windows are actually RC quality. So if you have an application that you want to experiment with, start looking at ASP.NET 5 on Windows today. And the reason is, our promise of portability is that once you get over to ASP.NET 5, getting it over to Linux and OSX is going to be trivial. The only exception here is that if you've taken dependency on platform-specific functionality. The third bullet, which I should have added to the slide, which I will do after this, is run your assemblies DLL through the portability analyzer, and then look at the reports. You will know within a couple of minutes where the hotspots are and where are the areas where your application will work just fine on Linux. The other thing that I would highly encourage you to do is we have a number of ways you can reach out to us. If you are particularly troubled by a certain area that you feel we should enable support for on Linux, this is exactly the kind of feedback that we need today. to make sure that the stack that we ship sometime in the future meets your requirements. So I would love you to try out your application, send us the report via the portability analyzer, and tell us what's missing from the stack that you really need as you transition from Windows over to Linux or OS X. OK. We have about 4 minutes left, and I want to spend some time on this slide. There are a lot of things on this slide, so let me actually try and break these down. But this is a really important slide when it comes to call to action. If you want to get the bits today and you have your own Linux or OS X box, go ahead and download the tar files. We've uploaded them to the Azure Blob storage, and you can go and get those right now. They're about, I think, 55, 60 megs, so it shouldn't take that long to actually download. The really nice thing about those bits is the fact that, as I said, we've packaged everything into a single binary package. I'm sorry. So when you untar it, you'll get all the bits. The other thing is you can download Visual Studio Code today from code.visualstudio.com. And then if you want to play around with Docker inside Visual Studio, go ahead and download the Visual Studio tools for Docker. That was published yesterday from AKMS VS Loves Docker. By far, the most friction-free way to evaluate the bits is to log into your Azure account and basically create the VM that I showed you. If you select Microsoft as the high-level node, you'll basically see as the last set of VMs the .NET on Linux VM. And as I said, it'll take you literally a couple of minutes to get the app running, try out Kestrel, so that you get a feel for what is it actually like to launch this application, what is it like to compile it, and so forth. We've published a number of tutorials. So if you want to go through the entire ABC of what's it like to create a console Hello World application, all the way to what's it like to create a ASP.NET 5 app, our tutorials will walk you through all that as well. And again, we have feedback links on the tutorial. If you want additional tutorials, if you want to learn more about additional things, please do let us know. Look at the Parts Unlimited application from Visual Studio or from the command line. And if you are interested, and I would be honored if some of you would be interested in coming along with the journey. It really helps the team out when we have an engaged developer community that actually helps to contribute to the work that the team is doing. That also helps you really understand where is .NET going, and also help actually make changes as we're building the product, unlike in the past where every 3 years would come along and essentially dump a bunch of bits on your lap. So how can you engage us? We've created a huge variety of ways for everyone, both in this room and online, to engage with us. We have our blog, which is actually the most popular MSDN blog. It gets around 500,000 visitors per month. And we regularly update the blog with both of our strategy as well as our latest releases. And also, we actually kind of collate the most frequently asked questions and regularly update the blog on what are the customers running into, and also what are the common questions coming up. Email, the team is listening, so if you want to email us, please go ahead. Facebook, Twitter, any of those channels would be wonderful. But the main ask is the fact that this is the beginning of a journey, and we really would love you guys, both in the room and also online, to engage with us. With that, I'd like to thank you very much, and have a great rest of the day.